Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you all for joining us. This is possibly the most people we've had in the room since lockdown, so that's really great to see. So thank you all for joining us. Myself and Kate, me being Emma, not just myself, really happy to kick off this first seminar to begin the year with one of our own, Dr. Philippa Walton. Philippa is a lecturer in Roman archaeology here at Leicester. Her research focuses on the material culture of Roman Britain, with a particular emphasis on data generated by the Portable Antiquities. It's the first one, I'm so sorry. Portable Antiquities Scheme. Her most recent project, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, explored the deposition of Roman objects in the River Tees at Piercebridge Empire and asked what they reveal about the identities of those who deposited them. In addition to working on riverine depositional practices, she's also published extensively on the function and use of coinage in Roman Britain, particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And I'm going to stop talking and let you take it away.
Thanks very much, Emma. Thank you so much for coming. I'm actually quite overwhelmed by the number of people who've come to listen to me speak on what's a windy and wet, horrible October evening. Anyway, what I want to do today is talk to you about my new research project, which is entitled Ritual, Rubbish and Retrieval in Roman Rivers. We like that alliteration in our research project titles. So it's a collaboration with colleagues at the Universities of Reading, Trier, Cologne, and the Landers Museum in Trier. And it very much builds on my previous research, which explored an assemblage of Roman objects which was found on the bed of the River Tees at Piercebridge in County Durham, and more on that later. Now, as the project only got started this February, what I'm going to do today is introduce you to our research questions and our methodology, as well as exploring some of the challenges we've come up against already, and present a few case studies that I'm starting to develop. So, my first encounter with archaeological objects in rivers came as a very small child, when I saw an episode of Blue Peter. No one Googled those presenters and find out how old I actually am. So this episode profiled the discovery of the Gilling Anglo-Saxon sword. And this had been found by a schoolboy who was playing in a stream near Richmond in North Yorkshire. Now, its discovery entitled the finder to a much coveted Blue Peter badge. And perhaps a little bizarrely, the sword also got a Blue Peter badge too. Now, even then, as a very small child, I wondered how the sword had come to be in the stream. Surely someone would have tried to retrieve something that was so valuable. And over the intervening years, I've repeatedly come across references to weapons, ceramics, coins, and a whole host of other objects being found in rivers. And as a finds liaison officer for the Portable Antiquities Scheme, I've even recorded a few. Now, river dredging, chance discoveries, mudlarking, underwater metal detecting, and most recently magnet fishing have all added to a burgeoning data set of archaeological material. This project therefore aims to bring together data specifically for Roman period Britain and for Roman period Germany, and to ask three very closely related questions. Why do Roman objects end up in riverine contexts, particularly at bridges and river crossings? Can close examination of the composition of these assemblages and their context provide some clues to whether they represent ritual deposits or rubbish disposal? And can we move beyond merely labeling these assemblages as ritual or rubbish to explore the identities of those involved in depositing objects in rivers? So, before trying to address these questions, it's worth reviewing how scholars have interpreted Roman riverine deposition and objects in the past. Now, the accidental loss of objects is the most common interpretation for both individual things and large assemblages of material being found in rivers. And the narratives usually focus on individual mishaps while crossing a river on foot or horseback. For example, solitary items of military equipment found on riverbeds across the continent are argued to be the result of unfortunate mishaps of soldiers on campaign. Of course, it would only take a small misstep on a slippery riverbed for a soldier like this one depicted on Trajan's column to lose the sword, the helmet, and the armor, which is precariously balanced on his shield. There's also frequently an attempt to weave stories around assemblages based on historical narratives, such as the 3rd century crisis on the continent. A very good example of this is the Neupotz hoard, which was found during dredging work in the Rhine in Germany last century. The hoard comprised more than 1,000 objects, including bronze and silver tableware, agricultural implements, tools, weapons, and religious objects. Despite the material having a wide date range and a wide range of functional categories, it's been interpreted almost invariably as booty, looted from a Gaulish villa estate, which a raiding party lost trying to cross the river in the turbulent years of the late 3rd century AD. The museum where it's displayed in Berlin refers to it as the barbarian treasure. Now, of course, shipwrecks are also suggested as a reason why objects turn up in riverine contexts. We know of numerous shipwrecks interpreted as both trading vessels and military patrol boats from waterways throughout the Roman world. Take, for example, the 6 wooden ships from De Meern in the Netherlands, which were excavated in the 1990s and early 2000s. Within the cabin of the ship shown here, De Meern 1, archaeologists recovered a number of finds which were presumed to have been the captain's personal belongings, including brooches, coins, and storage vessels, as well as carpentry and stoneworking tools. Rubbish disposal is also another dominant interpretation of riverine assemblages, and rivers and floodplains were clearly convenient dumping grounds for rubbish, while middens were frequently dug into the soft soil of riverbanks. Perhaps the most famous rubbish dump in the Roman world is one which slumped into a river outside the legionary fortress of Vindonissa in Switzerland, and known colloquially as the Schutthügel. Located outside the north gate of the fortress, in an area which sloped down to the river, dumping created a mound which even today is 200 meters long, 80 meters wide, and 18 meters high. I think the image of the excavations in the 1940s gives recent flood. Difficult to distinguish between the ancient riverbed explored extensively by scholars. Sort of perfect. Some Roman assemblages in water are interpreted through a votive lens, and good examples of this are provided by the Sacred Spring at Bath and well deposits like that at Draper's Gardens in London. However, fundamentally, here the spaces where objects are deposited are created or controlled by human agency, rather than being natural spaces. Finally, of course, objects found in Roman rivers could be a mixture of all these depositional processes, with rubbish mixed in with votive deposits, accidental losses, and riverine erosion all playing their part. What's key is establishing whether it's possible to identify these different depositional processes in the archaeological record. What's been clear from the outset of this project is that Roman archaeologists have made and repeated assumptions about depositional processes for riverine assemblages in the Roman period. Now, these assumptions are underpinned by a focus on the functional, the rational, and on using archaeology as the handmaiden of historical narratives. As a result, most object assemblages from riverine settings are only partially recorded, with special or valuable objects cherry-picked for cataloguing and subsequent publication. Particular object types are recorded, while others remain ignored. A great example of this being a riverine site in Verulamium, which was excavated by Freer in 1956. In his report on the site, he notes that great quantities of pottery and other objects, together with the following coins, were recovered from alluvial deposits, but only actually publishes the coins and not the other objects. Scholars also make unsupported judgments on what might represent ritual behavior in a Roman context. For example, an absence of objects with votive inscriptions and the presence of functional objects like tools and vessels have frequently been used to support the argument that the massive Neupots assemblage from the Rhine must be barbarian booty rather than prolonged evidence for votive deposition at one spot in the river. Some of these judgments are clearly underpinned by the particular way in which academic study has approached the study of the Roman world in general and the study of Roman bridges in particular. And bridges and river crossings are one of the main places where these assemblages are found. There's a clear focus on their architectural sophistication and their permanence, something which these reconstruction images of Roman bridges in northern Britain conveys. In summary, the study of Roman bridges tends to ignore human engagement with what they represent, a mastery over natural forces. And it's really clear if we look closely at the archaeological evidence that crossing a river was a deeply symbolic and sometimes dangerous act throughout the Roman period. Just think of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Sacrifices were required to keep river gods like the mighty river Danube on side. Here seen surveying Roman soldiers crossing a pontoon bridge in a detail from Trajan's column. Altars were frequently set up next to or even on bridges and were dedicated to specific deities, such as sea and river gods. Altars to Neptune and Oceanus found in the River Tyne at Newcastle are likely to come from the Pons Aelius, the Aelian bridge, after which the settlement there was named. Carvings of apotropaic phalluses have been found decorating bridges throughout the Roman world, including examples at Chesters in Northumberland and the Pont du Gard in the south of France. The example on the right-hand side from the Pont du Gard has really gone overboard in trying to ritually protect the structure and those who crossed it, not only depicting a phallus with a phallus, but also a tail shaped like a phallus. So when we're thinking about Roman objects found at bridges or river crossings, we have to remember the possible religious motivations for deposition as well as the rational functional ones. We need to review the types of objects deposited and where exactly they're found. And the best way forward is to study all the objects found rather than selected highlights. Of course, that's not always possible given the fact that riverine deposits are rarely systematically excavated by archaeologists, but instead found by dredging or paddling or by schoolboys in streams. However, there are a few places in the Roman world where this is possible.
Let's just minimize the
Oh, okay, I can't see it on the screen.
Yeah, it's on an extended one.
Sorry.
This is the very last time.
Thanks. Oh, now it's my screen stuck.
This is the last time. I'm just going to hide down here. Okay. Pardon.
Yep. Oh, I hope so.
That wasn't the last time.
So the first example we're going to look at is Piercebridge in County Durham, where in the mid-1980s, two divers, Bob Middlemas and Rolf Mitchinson, began diving in the River Tees. They were diving as part of a local archaeological society's project to locate Roman bridges and to record them in the northeast. While they were diving and recording some quite significant bridge structures, they began to discover thousands of Roman objects on the riverbed. And from 1996 until Rolf's death in 2019, collecting these objects became the main focus of their diving and attention. Now, their assemblage formed the focus of my previous Leverhulme-funded research project, which I undertook with Professor Helle Eckhart at the University of Reading. What I'm going to now summarise some of the key points from our open access monograph, Bridge Over Troubled Water. So do seek that out on the ADS website if you want to learn more. It's available completely free of charge to download. The village of Piercebridge sits at a strategic point where the Roman road from the legionary fortress at York to the northern frontier crosses the River Tees. It's not that surprising that some Roman objects might be found in the Tees at Piercebridge. The site's well known for its Roman archaeology and has been the subject of excavation and field survey throughout the 20th century. It was a strategic river crossing, and a settlement which grew up there quickly became a small town in the 1st century AD. This settlement had several pottery kilns producing ceramic vessels and perhaps acted as a supply depot for the northern military sites into the 2nd century. Funerary epitaphs found in the surrounding area around Piercebridge indicate the presence of soldiers from 3 legions in the 2nd century, the Legio II Augusta, the Legio VI Victrix, and the Legio XXII Primigenia. The fort, which is still visible as earthworks around the modern village today, appears to date to about a century later, from around AD 260 to 280. Now, when the assemblage started to be found in the 1980s, it was initially interpreted as representing rubbish deposited in the river or washed out through military bathhouse drains. However, the location of the material in the river, which was recorded meticulously, if somewhat haphazardly, by the divers in a series of diaries, would seem to preclude this as an interpretation. The finds were clustered towards the middle of the river and just downstream of the remains of a wooden bridge. And you can see them marked on this spot on the plan by the red X. And this would suggest that for whatever reason, the finds were thrown into the river from this bridge and settled in the calm waters behind the bridge structure. So what did the divers find? Well, over the course of more than 30 years, they recovered 2,200 objects, 1,444 coins, 40 kilos of pottery, and 15 kilos of animal bone. They also retrieved even more things like leather shoes, leather tent panels, and other organic material, which they reburied after they realized they couldn't afford to undertake conservation on the material. Now, what was really important when they reported these finds to me was to record the entire assemblage rather than attaching significance to particular artifact types like coinage or gold jewelry. Therefore, with the help of a range of specialists, James Gerrard at Newcastle looked at the pottery, Roger Tomlin at the lead ceilings, as well as other specialists looking at animal bone. I recorded all the objects and coins in the assemblage on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, while providing an overview of each artifact type in discussion in our monograph. Following initial cataloguing, it was then a question of exploring the chronology and function of the assemblage. It wasn't possible to date absolutely everything in the assemblage, but as you can see, the majority of objects were Roman, including the samples of animal bone, which we had C14 dated. There is, of course, some material from other periods. This includes an Iron Age mirror handle, some early medieval brooches, some medieval buckles, and a range of fittings from buckets and molting floor tiles, which were all relatively modern. Whilst it's possible that some of these things may have been deliberately deposited in the river, it does suggest that rubbish was also present, even if only in small quantities. When I started to look at the assemblage as a whole, it's really apparent that the Roman material in the assemblage is exceptionally rich, with almost every type of Roman artifact you can think of being present, from items of jewelry through to medical equipment, from wine strainers and beer tankards through to military equipment and coins. While the Romans were notorious for leaving lots of rubbish behind, this is more than just what you might expect from an urban rubbish dump. The quality of preservation of the objects was also high, with many of the objects being complete. For example, brooches still had their pins and could be used as brooches today. Fingerings still had their intaglios intact. So when I was looking at this assemblage, I also thought it was really important to contextualize it by comparing it with material both recovered from the excavations of the adjacent small town and fort, as well as other Roman sites in the region. These two graphs illustrate some of those comparisons. The first shows the contrast in the chronological distribution of the coinage in the river compared with that found during excavations at Piercebridge. Now, this suggests that the assemblage does not represent riverine erosion of the settlement deposits or rubbish, as the chronological composition is completely different. The Roman assemblage from the river focuses on the 1st to 3rd century, whereas that from the excavations focuses on the 3rd to 4th century. The second plot, a correspondence analysis plot, immediately indicates the difference in the composition of the riverine and excavation assemblages at Piercebridge and its unique nature in a Northern Roman context. The range of material, its date, and its preservation all tends to suggest that these objects were deliberately deposited in the river. But can we tease out any motivations behind that deposition? Well, there are a small but significant assemblage of objects which could be deemed to have religious resonances. These include a pipe clay figurine of the god Mercury and two small copper alloy figurines of his attributes, the goat, symbolizing fertility, and the tortoise, referring to his invention of the lyre from a tortoise shell. Mercury was the god of trade and commercial success, as well as being the messenger of the gods, and was therefore the patron of merchants and travelers. The figurines that you can see here might have been the type of thing you would find in a household shrine and would have acted as a focus for personal religious devotion. Another object associated with Mercury is this lead alloy figurine from a portable shrine of a type rarely found in Roman Britain. They're more commonly found in the province of Pannonia, which is modern-day Hungary. And you can see here it compared with a more complete version, which has been found at Wallsend Roman Fort in Tyne and Wear. There are also a series of objects associated with the god Mars. These include a silver fingering with a dedicatory inscription to the god, as well as a pierced ceremonial spear and a small copper alloy miniaturized version. These objects suggest interaction with a deity who was particularly popular with the Roman army. Now, despite the presence of some objects which can be classified as being religious in character, the majority of the assemblage represents objects with personal resonances, And these can help us explore the identities of people living, working, or passing through Piercebridge in the Roman period. There are hundreds of objects associated with the military sword belt and scabbard, including belt plates from the actual belt, as well as scabbard slides from the scabbard. While these objects could be small enough to be accidental losses rather than votive in nature, the huge numbers in which they've been found is really striking. And it's the fact that no comparable examples of military dress have been found in the excavations of the fort and the small town at Piercebridge, which is particularly important. It's also worth remembering that the sword was a potent symbol of military identity. If a soldier was to make an offering to Mars or another deity, it makes sense that he chose something worn close to the body and with significance to his profession. Similarly, more than 100 items of Roman military horse harness were recovered from the river. Like the sword belt, the harness and equipment of your horse was extremely important to the expression of Roman cavalry identity. The assemblage of horse harness and equipment is unique in a Romano-British context, and again suggests unusual depositional processes in the River Tees. For example, it's worth noting that there are more items of horse harness found in the River Tees at Piercebridge than in all the Roman cavalry forts on Hadrian's Wall put together. And again, no cavalry equipment whatsoever was found during excavations at Piercebridge. Interestingly, there are also substantial quantities of objects associated with women and children. These include copper alloy and bone hairpins, as well as numerous items of gold jewelry, including necklaces and earrings. While finger rings were also worn by men, analysis of ring sizes suggests that the majority of finger rings from the riverine assemblage fall within the range usually associated with women and children. And what's really striking is that the most precious of those finger rings fall within the child size range. One includes a reset Iron Age glass sphere, which was more than 300 years old at the time of being recycled, whereas the other finger ring was set with a garnet, which was probably sourced in India or Sri Lanka. Now, who were these women and children? The 2nd and 3rd century date of most of the finds associated with them suggests that they were wives, tradeswomen, and female slaves who were brought there with the military community. And the unparalleled number of pieces of gold jewelry suggests the presence of at least some very wealthy, high-status women from the upper echelons of military society. Thinking a little bit more about identities, the assemblage contains a range of finds which highlight the connected nature of the Roman Empire. They include a worn coin of Juba II of Numidia, which had travelled all the way from what's modern-day Algeria and dates to around 25 BC. Such coins are quite rare in a Romano-British context, although oddities like this do turn up in temple and votive sites from time to time in Roman Britain. And there's considerable debate about whether they represent offerings with personal resonances or an attempt to palm off non-legal tender on the gods. There are also numerous types of Roman brooch which are associated with the continent, particularly the Roman army on the upper Danube and the German frontiers. Similarly, there are several types of military sword belt fittings, which are usually only found in Dacia, modern-day Romania. And there's also that lead votive plaque of Mercury. These are most frequently found in modern-day Hungary rather than in Britain. Then from further to the east, we have fragments of a type of gold earring only paralleled in Thrace, which is in modern Turkey. And this perhaps suggests the presence of a wealthy woman from the Eastern Roman Empire. Finally, there are lead sealings of a type used to seal consignments of goods, which have Greek inscriptions on them. And this seems to indicate the import of goods from somewhere in the Greek-speaking East. Parallels for these in Britain are extremely rare. Only 4 others are known from the province. And Roger Tomlin has suggested that these sealed consignments are cloth. And if it was coming from the Mediterranean region all the way to Piercebridge, it was likely to be something very special and very expensive. So in summary, our methodology involved examining the entire assemblage, looking at its composition and context, while comparing it with material from the excavations at Piercebridge and the wider region, while concluding that there was likely a significant ritual element to deposition in the river, perhaps related to its location as a stage on the way to the northern frontier. We also attempted to move beyond the binary opposition between ritual and rubbish to think about Roman identities too. While undertaking our study of the Piercebridge assemblage, one question we wanted to answer was whether it was unique in a Romano-British context. Was it possible to identify riverine deposition elsewhere in Roman Britain to better contextualize and understand the phenomenon? Well, my colleague Helle Eckert and I started searching for references to other Roman riverine finds, intending to include a small chapter on them in our monograph on Piercebridge. But we soon realized that there were numerous examples which deserved an entire project way beyond the scope of what was possible for Piercebridge. So as part of our current project, we're now trawling through excavation reports, historic environment records, data, newspaper reports, talking to archaeologists, and sitting quietly on forums for mudlarks to create a database of Roman finds. Although it's in its early stages, we've already come across more than 350 riverine sites with Roman finds. Some, like the head of Hadrian from the Thames and the Wensum helmet from Suffolk, are well known as objects, but their riverine context has not been investigated in detail. While others, like a huge assemblage of material from Lincoln's riverside, remain completely unpublished. Our hope is that when this trawl is complete, it will be possible to identify patterns by finds type and explore relationships with settlements and river crossings, size of river, and lots more besides. We also hope to develop 10 detailed case studies which highlight some of the complexities of working with Roman riverine assemblages. These will focus on particular rivers, objects, or sites. And even though we're in the early stages of a project, I've identified 2 to work on already. The first will focus on the River Witham in Lincolnshire. Here, the 18th century naturalist Sir Joseph Banks collected finds dredged from the River Witham near his country estate, and these included Iron Age, Roman, and medieval objects. He wrote a manuscript cataloguing these finds, excerpts of which were published in the late 19th century Lincolnshire Notes and Queries. He corresponded with lots of friends describing the finds, and even undertook some early experiments in metallurgical analysis. Now, the aim of my case study will be to attempt to reconstruct his collection of Roman finds using this archive, and to explore the extent to which his antiquarian interest has influenced our understanding of watery deposition in Lincolnshire. The second case study will focus on an assemblage from the River Vere in Verulamium, where in the summer of 1955, Shepherd Frere excavated Site R at a river crossing leading from the Roman theatre to the Folly Lane temple complex. Frere published these excavations at the river crossing and even suggested that the site may have been a focus for votive deposition. However, as I've already mentioned, his publication omitted discussion of the majority of the objects recovered during the excavation, which he refers to merely as other objects. My aim here is to reconstruct the composition of the entire riverine assemblage using Frere's excavation notebooks, which are currently in Verulamium Museum, and I had the opportunity to look at just last week. I'll also be trying to match those to accessioned objects within Verulamium Museum collections. I'll then try to think about how this site fits into the religious landscape in Verulamium and how the assemblage compares with other riverine finds elsewhere in the province. My preliminary analysis of the assemblage indicates that while coins do dominate the assemblage, there are also other objects, including numerous hairpins, brooches, glass vessels, and even an inscribed pewter plate that definitely deserve more attention. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, this project is a collaboration with colleagues in Germany. And so in the final few minutes, I'll briefly outline the research that they're undertaking there. This involves adopting and adapting the methodology we used at Piercebridge to explore a huge assemblage of Roman objects found in the River Moselle in Trier. In the late Roman period, Trier was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire. And numerous buildings survive from this period, including the magnificent Porta Nigra Gate, the Constantinian Basilica, and several bath complexes. Alongside these monuments, the stone piers of a substantial Roman bridge over the Moselle also survive. One summer in the mid-1970s, the river levels were particularly low, and the people of Trier enjoyed using the Moselle as a giant paddling pool, swimming and wading in the shadow of the stone bridge piers. Soon, however, these bathers began to discover Roman objects in their thousands, and paddling turned to treasure hunting, as hundreds of people began searching for Roman objects using wheelbarrows, sieves, and inflatables to help them in the process. The German tabloid press at the time captured the gold rush atmosphere, and the coverage encouraged huge numbers of people to search for artifacts. While some of these were donated to the museum, others remained in private ownership. Now, the aim of the German team on the project is to try to catalogue and analyse the entire assemblage, Piercebridge style, as only exceptional or rare objects have been catalogued by the Landesmuseum thus far. These rare objects include the provincial coin assemblage, a statuette of Attis, and a bronze fitting from a votive prow. However, the majority of the material remains uncatalogued in the museum's store and includes 32,000 Roman coins, at least 4,000 objects, and many kilos of pottery. There's also other objects that still remain the property of a variety of collectors who are getting very, very old, and some of them have recently died. And at the bottom of this slide, you can see a display of some of the material from the river within the collector's own home. So over the past 6 months, the German team have begun to record all this material and to get an idea of the composition and character of the assemblage as a whole. They're opening up boxes in the museum stores and recording the surprises inside, from stamp tiles to box fittings to key handles. And this has been supplemented by targeted visits by myself and the rest of the British team, offering moral support and specialist coinage identification skills. Here you can see me doing chronological sorting of the 32,000 Roman coins in the assemblage, with each bucket on the floor representing the reign of a Roman emperor. So what are our next steps? Well, over the next 2 years, the German team aim to create an overview of the Moselle assemblage and assess how to contextualize it. This is going to be quite difficult given the relative lack of small finds publication for Roman Trier as a whole. They'll also begin interviewing finders and collectors to explore their motivations and the biographies of the objects they collected. Meanwhile, the British team will work on completing a survey of riverine deposition in Britain and use it to explore patterns of chronology, geography, and composition. We'll also research a range of case studies on other assemblages and riverine sites. And finally, we hope to have some lasting impact on the way in which the riverine archaeological resource is treated, particularly given the surge in popularity of underwater metal detecting, mudlarking, and magnet fishing. We hope to develop policy guidance for the reporting, recording, and initial conservation of archaeological objects from non-tidal riverine contexts in England and Wales. And I'll obviously keep you posted as the project progresses. And finally, I just want to thank everyone on the team, because although I'm presenting to you this evening, this is very much a collaborative team effort with scholars at the University of Cologne and Trier, curators at the Landesmuseum in Trier, and Hella and Carolina working at Reading. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was great and perfectly to time. First bit of housekeeping, we're going to go into questions, but the housekeeping is, as burning as your question may be, please contain said fire until the microphone is in your hand, just so we're inclusive to our online audiences. So do we have any questions in the room? Oh.
Thank you, Philippa. It's really interesting. I like as you said, kind of this idea of like broadening out and like focusing on not just kind of these prestige objects that have been the focus of previous research. I think maybe in relation to the Piercebridge excavations or the diving even, you mentioned that a lot of animal remains have been found, and I was curious whether you include these in kind of as objects, and also what's your approach generally on kind of, if not just animal remains more broadly, do you find any human remains in these assemblages? Would you consider these objects, or are they being treated in some way?
So they're not treated as objects as such, but they're recorded as any excavation assemblage would be. So all the animal bone that was recovered from the river was sent to an animal bone specialist and recorded at a level of detail that a specialist would do for any specialist report for a publication. We also chose to sample some of those animal bones from Piercebridge because we were quite concerned that they were just modern rubbish. And although we only managed to afford 5 C14 dates, all of those dates came back within quite a narrow range in the Roman period. So we were quite convinced that all the material from all that animal bone in the river was Roman in date. And the divers at Piercebridge were quite comprehensive in picking out everything from the riverbeds. So not only the animal bone, but all objects, lead, little bits of iron, everything, not just the shiny stuff. There was no human remains found at Piercebridge, although I did for a while have a little plastic bag with something that I thought was part of a human humerus, but I was told categorically it wasn't. But if we had human remains at any site, we would record those as well too.
And I guess just as a very quick follow-up, would you consider the animal remains here potentially as also kind of being votive depositions, or do you treat them quite separately in that regard?
So it depends on the context in which those finds are made in the river. All the material at Piercebridge was found in quite a concentrated area within the middle of the river, maybe 5 meters by 5 meters squared, and it was stuck to the bottom of the river. So we think that the animal bone assemblage was part of the votive deposition, whether it represent feasting on the bridge over the river or something that was relevant to deposition at some point, maybe something that happened in the temple complex nearby, but it was all deposited in the river with the object. So we treated it as part of the overall assemblage.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. I'm curious about the people who are doing deposition and whether you get the sense that this represents a Roman, distinctively Roman thing, or whether it's perhaps the persistence of a pre-Roman native tradition.
It's very difficult to unpick that. At Piercebridge, for example, there are some Iron Age objects in the river, and there is some suggestion that they may be related to the hill fort at Stanwick, which is about 3 or 4 kilometres to the south of the river, as a trackway from Stanwick meets the place where the river crosses the Tees, where all these objects have been found. However, I would be hesitant about trying to say that they're definitely a continuation of Iron Age practice at the site, because there is a slight gap between the Iron Age material and the real focus in the late 2nd and 3rd century, more than a slight gap, 150 years. Again, there is this tendency to see, to really appreciate Iron Age votive deposition, and anything in water is ritual in the Iron Age, and anything in the Roman period is rubbish. I think the answer to the question is really complex about what's continuation and what's Roman tradition. By looking at the identities of people involved at Piercebridge, it very much looks like the Roman military community, and that isn't necessarily Romans from Italy. These are people who've come from Germany, from Dacia, from Pannonia, all over the place, but they're expressing their Romanness in the deposit.
And is there any patterning in terms of why some rivers and not others? That's my question, I suppose.
It's very difficult to answer that question because these finds are only found by chance. You can't really systematically look at material from every single river, because they're found by dredging or by just by schoolboys paddling in streams. So we have come to some conclusions about Piercebridge. We think at Piercebridge, because there are a series of altars to Mars Condates, Mars of the confluence, that have been found at Piercebridge and at other northern sites, that it may be to do with the confluence of rivers at particular places, or be associated with crossing a river. So at Piercebridge, we've got the crossing of the River Tees with Deer Street, which runs from the legionary fortress at York all the way to the northern frontier. And you can see it as a particularly appropriate place to make an offering to the gods on your way to the frontier, where you're going to be fighting those horrible little Britunculi on the north of Hadrian's Wall, or perhaps on the way back to York thinking, yes, I've survived this terrible experience of being on the frontier, you know, at the very edge of the Roman world, you know, marking that progression either way. But in other places, it's very difficult to see the exact significance. And that's probably why a lot of scholars have plumped for the, you know, accidental loss rather than the deliberate deposition hypothesis.
We've got a question online, and I'll come down to you, Alvaro. So Anna in the chat has asked, how long does the project in Trier have funding for?
3 years.
3 years. Cool. Nice and simple.
Mm-hmm.
Alvaro, get my steps in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is that do you have plans in the future to do stable isotopes in the animal bones that you have found?
So with the Piercebridge material, we've put a pause on doing more investigation on it because we've published a monograph and we ran out of money for working on that particular assemblage. It was very difficult to interest a funding body on doing primary data recording, and we had to dress it up as being interpretive rather than recording for the funding bodies to be interested. So unfortunately, no, not at the moment, although there's always the possibility of doing more scientific analysis, particularly on the material from Trier as the project progresses, because they're just opening boxes and finding all sorts of things, and we'll have to work out on the hoof, so to speak, how we're going to deal with that material.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've got two more, so one Joel and then Leif, and then we'll finish that off.
It's about Piercebridge. When you compare the coins, it seems that from excavated ones and the ones in the water, it seems that they disappear way before on the water. On the water, they disappear way before the excavated ones. Are only the coins that disappear? Other votive objects disappear? And if yes, why?
So in the river at Piercebridge, the main focus and chronology of all the objects is on the late 2nd and early 3rd century. And there's a real drop-off of material after that date. Why that is, and why that contrasts so significantly with the material on during the excavation at Piercebridge, I don't know. But there's a very definite and difference there. But it seems that the real focus on deposition is in between 190 and maybe 230 from both the object and the coin data, and perhaps, and I'm very hesitant about trying to weave this into historical narratives, but it could be something to do with Septimius Severus's campaigns in northern Britain and moving from York to the northern frontier, particularly given the huge amounts of precious metal jewelry and stuff from all over the empire that is very unusual. The level of gold jewelry at Piercebridge is more than you find in Roman York, which is bizarre. So there's something very specific and very unusual happening at Piercebridge, but why that's happening then is, you know, open to interpretation.
You've mentioned that there were many sites that you have interpreted as having riverine depositions. Did you notice any patterns with the quantities of different materials that you found there that might suggest a sort of countrywide or even Europe-wide sort of pattern of deposition, or are each site unique?
So Leaf, we've only started doing this in February. So those are exactly the questions we want to ask of the data. But at the moment, we're just gathering all that information and putting it into our database. What I would say from just my impression of working on the data is that coinage is quite common in these deposits and objects of personal adornment, so things like hairpins and brooches. In terms of dating, it really varies. So some materials very early in date, some materials very late, but most of it seems to be found in rivers, at bridges and river crossings and fords. Whether that's a real ancient pattern or just because it's easier to access rivers in those points and find those things is open to interpretation. And also, of course, there's huge amounts of stuff being recorded in Lincolnshire. And is that really because they were really keen on dropping stuff in water in the Roman period in Lincolnshire, or because Sir Joseph Banks had his country estate there and just happened to be really good at recording material in the 18th century, when they were dredging all the rivers and creating loads of canals and drainage works? So there's loads of things to weigh up and interpret, but we'll be doing that towards the end of this year, and you can come back and ask me then, and I'll be able to give you definite answers, or more definite answers.
I think we're going to have to clear a space for you on the programme next year. Yeah, so that is us for the first time. Thank you everyone for coming, especially thanks to our friends online who had to bear with some start of term Teams issues, but we'll have those sorted for next week. You've started us off really well between online and in person, 100 people, so absolutely smashed it, so thank you very much. We are now going to head to the Old Horse on London Road, where you can have alcoholic, non-alcoholic beverages and a chat to your fancy. Next week we'll have Jane Maseglia in talking about women of a certain age, so please do join us for that. And could we finish with a final round of applause for Philippa, please?